Okay, for this practice worksheet today, we're not only practicing how to blend color pencils to create a realistic drawing, but we're also practicing the actual steps of the project. And the first step of the project is to block out your drawing of the paint blob. So what I'm doing, the method I'm using to draw my paint blob is the siding method, where you're really just trying to see the relationships of the shapes that are created and like how close they are to the edge of the paper. The reference photo we're working from is proportional to the square that we're actually drawing on. So that means that if the paint blob were to run off the page, then it should run off on my drawing as well, but it doesn't, as you can see. So all these lines you see running to the edge of the paper, what that is, those are just like imaginary lines, construction lines, plumb lines, siding lines, whatever you want to call them. And what I'm doing is I'm drawing a line from the furthest out edge of the paint blob to the edge of the paper so that I can kind of assess and help me block out how far out my paint blob needs to be drawn. And same with all the different curves of the paint blob. How high does it go? I kind of make a mark to the edge of the paper. It almost hits halfway in between the top of the paper. Even though it doesn't actually reach the edge, I know where to kind of make it the highest point of my paint blob. Also, you can see me like tracing on top of the actual reference photo. This is really important because it actually helps you to create like muscle memory. If you trace over your drawing several times and then go and move on to the paper you're drawing on, you can actually replicate this same motion and it helps you to draw the shape you were just trying to draw. Also, you need to erase your construction lines like you see, and you need to draw the highlights and the shadows you see. So it's really important to notice that the highlights are really crisp edges, whereas the shadows are very blended edges, meaning they don't have harsh lines. So that's one method to drawing out your paint blob. Another method is actually the grid method. And because we're working with square paper for our project, even though our practice is not square, you can tell this is a rectangle, you can use just a simple 4-square grid, and you would just divide your paper in half pretty much on both sides. So for the practice paper, you can see that the bottom, I ended up dividing the image in half long ways, and now I'm also dividing it the other way as well. And you can see I kind of got a little bit off. So then I went back and rechecked. That's really important because we're really just, if you're going to use the grid method, just keep it a simple 4-square grid. I say 4 squares, it's really 4 parts. So you're just dividing your paper in half one way, and then you're dividing your paper in half the other way. But like I said, for your final project, it's an actual square, so it makes it much easier to measure out. So make your tick marks on both sides. That's very important using the grid method, and then you will connect those tick marks using your ruler. So once you have your grid drawn on your reference photo, then you can do it on the actual paper, or in this case, the little rectangle that you're going to be drawing on. Now, I'm also going to try and put a tutorial on how to use the grid website, griddrawingtoolwebsite.com on Google Classroom, and also how to use the grid app on your phone so that it can make it easier for you in case you don't have your reference photo printed out. But as you can see, once you have 4 equal parts on your reference photo and 4 equal parts on the paper you're drawing on, you're going to draw what you see in each part. Think of it as like a quadrant. So and I know that's a math term, but what I do is I try and kind of create some almost like construction lines to see where my paint blob is going to hit on my intersection, like my 2 lines that I've created that intersect. And so I see that the right side of the paint blob actually comes out further than the halfway mark, and that's what that little tick mark is that's slightly to the left of it. And I see it goes further than that, so I draw my paint blob further out than that. I love the grid method. I find some kids get frustrated with having to do math, so you're also welcome to do the other method as well, just the siding method, noticing how close it runs to the edge, like I did in my first drawing. And just like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to draw out your shadows. And the shadows in this picture are blended edges that actually exist on the paint blob, whereas the shadow on the left side is actually a really crisp edge. So it's going to be important for you to recognize that when you actually start shading. And finally, this is still the siding method with this last paint blob, but one thing I forgot to mention earlier is you can break whatever you're drawing down into just basic shapes. So I'm using basic shapes. I'm still having to create some like imaginary lines that run to the edge of the paper so that it helps me to see how really where this paint blob should go in the rectangle, because it can be kind of confusing. You might end up drawing something too small if you don't pay attention to that. And it's really important. Our paper and our reference photo are proportional. So however much space your paint blob takes up in your reference photo, it should take up the same amount of space in your drawing as well. So don't draw it too small, you'll get points taken off. And what I'm doing now is I'm actually lining my ruler up with like the angle of the top of the paint blob. And as long as I don't move my wrist around, I should get that angle correct. And that's also really important for the tail of that paint blob. You can see me, again, tracing the shape with my pencil, and then I move over to my drawing and I trace it, kind of like repeat the same motion. I notice the tail doesn't go further than the front of the paint blob, so all of those things, that's called siding. That's where you pay attention to how the actual shapes and angles and details of your reference photo, where they match up, how they line up so that it helps you to draw it. Now, whatever method you want to use to draw your paint blob, that is totally up to you. And just as you can tell, if you erase on top of a printed image, it actually erases your ink, which would mess you up when you start shading. So if you need to draw it on your computer, you can screenshot the photo that I provide on Google Classroom, and then you can actually use like the drawing tool or app on your computer to draw any plumb lines or siding lines or even a grid on it if you needed to. So first step is just getting everything lightly drawn out. I strongly suggest doing this with a really light color pencil so it blends in with your color pencil when you start coloring, but I'm using a pencil so it shows up well for my demo. It's just really important that when I start coloring, I actually have to pay attention to erasing my color pencil so that it doesn't show up too dark. And you can see I kind of drew a little circle in the center because I noticed that center circle that almost looks like a donut hole, it was much smaller on the reference photo than it appears on my drawing. So I'm kind of trying to go back and make that work for the picture as well. Okay, so once you have your paint blob all drawn out, including the shadows and the highlights, not just the basic outline, you can move on to the fun part, which is coloring. It's really important if you used a pencil, you go through and you actually erase any dark lines because you don't want any dark lines showing up through your color pencil. Once you color over them, you can't really erase them. So it's important that you lighten your drawing before you get started. Some things about color pencil. I personally like to put a cushion underneath my paper. I just find it helps me to color lighter rather than on a hard surface or a hard table. I tend to accidentally color a little bit too dark with the color pencil. And it's really important, this whole process, it's all about coloring with light layers. So it really doesn't matter if you start with like your dark areas or your mid-tones. I wouldn't start with your light areas first. But most artists tend to start with their dark areas and just very lightly block them out. So starting with their shadows and put some really light layers of, like, in my picture, I'm going to use like browns and purples. But for the majority of my paint blob, I really just see this like a red color, but it has a very warm tone to it, meaning it's closer to a red orange than it is a red violet. So I'm kind of leaning more towards the warmer tones, undertones of reds, rather than the cooler tones of reds. And I'm just going to glaze my entire shape first with this red-orange tone because even in the shaded areas, it still has that undertone of red-orange. So I'm glazing the entire shape that I've drawn with the red-orange, keeping it a really light layer, trying to color in small circles, trying to keep a nice even layer and keep it blended. I am not coloring as dark in my shadows because I really want to layer some different colors into my shadows to make it look dynamic. So once I've glazed it, I can go in and I can start to work in my other colors into my shadows. So I'm actually going to try a little bit of purple. I kind of test it out. And if you're not sure, you're like, that just looks like a shadow to me. Test out your colors next to it and see if you see any of the tones. Squint your eyes and really study your reference photo. And if you squint your eyes, you might actually be able to pull out some different colors that you wouldn't have seen right off the bat. Because when we squint them, you can the colors start to separate a little bit and make it easier to pick out. So I'm going to glaze a little bit of purple over where the shaded area is. That's why it's so important for you to actually draw where your shadows are going to go. And then I go in with a darker brown tone, not black. Save black for the very end. That's when you can go in and punch in some black and it will really create some contrast, but build your way up to the darkest value. So I'm going to actually block in and add some brown tones to darken my shadow, making sure I'm not coloring too hard on the edges of the shadow because it's not a crisp edge for a shadow. It's a very blended edge. It blends a little bit. It's a little bit fuzzy on the edge of the shadow. So that's why I'm trying to be very careful not to create a really harsh edge. Anytime you're trying to create a blended edge, always color into the two areas that you're trying to blend with the lighter color, which in my case is this red-orange color. So I'm going to start to layer the red-orange even more over the shadow, and that's just because I'm trying to get it more saturated. I'm trying to get it brighter. I'm trying to layer it more so it really starts to pop off the page. And I also add a little bit of orange because I'm like, I still see some orange in the red tone underneath. So I layered a light layer of orange, and then I'm going to go back and really start to layer the red orange back on top. The more you color over and over and over again, even with really light pressure, the brighter it will start to become. Or if you're using a dark color, the darker it would become. So always work in light pressure layers and just gradually build your way up to where it's really bright and stands off the page. This actual video was probably like 30 minutes long. I took 30 minutes to draw this little bitty paint blob. Some of y'all saw me working on it in class, in between different classes as well. So just because we are practicing on a small paper doesn't mean you shouldn't put a good amount of effort into it. If you really take your time and do a good job and try and blend the colors together, it's going to take you a little bit of time, and that's okay. The final paper is going to be much larger than the square that you're practicing on today, and so that means that sometimes it can be hard to color over a large area and keep it blended. So instead what you need to do is just color in light layers, keep it almost like small circular motions, but not where you see the circles. Just make sure you're doing a really even layer and you're covering the paper each time, not leaving gaps in between your pencil marks and leaving it streaky. So you can see that even though I have started to build up my color, I really want to get it brighter in my practice paint blob. So I'm going in with the more crimson color and I'm kind of building up my tones a little bit. Again, you're wanting it to get bright. You're wanting it to stand out from across the room, but you want to also keep it blended. And the only way to do that is working in light layers. So I just gradually keep going back and forth, coloring back on top of each other, going back. If my shadow doesn't seem dark enough, I do another light layer of my brown tone or even my purple tone, and mixing that brown and purple with the red. That's something that y'all wouldn't have thought of initially, but it makes it more dynamic in the end. So it's really important that just because you see a shadow, you don't just color it black. So try and find the other tones existing in your reference photo. I then finally start to put in some black to really punch up the contrast. And as you can tell, you can kind of erase if you get a little bit out of the lines, but you can only erase if you work in those light layers. If you start out pressing down really hard, it actually wrinkles the paper, makes it way too shiny, and you won't be able to erase if you mess up. So it's important to work in those light layers, like I've said a million times, and you're probably getting sick of me saying this. I add yellow just to kind of punch some contrast in and also try and make it brighter. And then I focus on the shadows where the paint blob is actually sitting on the paper. I strongly suggest you going in and doing this because it makes your drawing look more realistic. Also, it's really important to notice in your reference photo that there's probably going to be something called a reflected light, and that's when light hits an object, it casts a shadow on one side, but at the same time it casts a shadow, it reflects a little bit of color back onto the object. So where I'm coloring right now, I actually notice in my reference photo that there's some red right on the edge of the paint blob next to that dark shadow on the right. So I go in with my eraser and I put the red back in. So a highlight doesn't necessarily have to be a white area. It could be just a lighter area in the shadow, just like you see right now. Finally, the last thing I do is add a little bit of white to the highlights and the highest areas of my paint blob to really create the most contrast and a full range of value. You could also do this with a white gel pen if you accidentally colored over them. And here's my final. I ended up coloring the background to really make it pop using a color that contrasts well with red. Just choose a color that's different than the color that is your actual paint blob so it really stands out. And I colored into my shadows where it was resting on the paper, and it just made it feel more realistic. A few final things to note about these color pencils is that I just used regular Crayola color pencils, and I feel like it turned out really well. So you don't have to have the fanciest color pencils. It's just sometimes more important to focus on how you color.